With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Charlie Hyde, and he's going to tell us about the arsenal of democracy, and I'm looking forward to hearing this as much as anyone. You're up.
Good evening. Am I going out? Yes. I promised Randy I'd keep my presentation under 2 hours tonight, so I'm going to try to keep it down to that level. Just joking. Today I'm going to talk about one of the critical parts of the U.S. defense industry that provided American and Allied forces with enormous amounts of vehicles, aircraft, engines, weapons, and various other materials which were vital to our ultimate victory against the Axis powers in World War II. I'm referring, of course, to Michigan industry, and more specifically, I'm going to talk about the automobile industry in Detroit and Michigan and elsewhere. We were remarkably important and prodigious in contributing to the war materiel. At the time the war began, Michigan had 4% of the population of the United States. But during the war, Michigan received 10% of the value of all the war contracts issued nationally. 10% came here. So we were very, very important. Of course, many Michigan companies, other than the automobile makers, also did defense work. Michigan auto industry made huge numbers of tanks, trucks, and Jeeps, but also a bewildering variety of other things. The industry made aircraft engines, aircraft components, complete airplanes, such as here at Willow Run. And the automobile industry accounted for 1/4 of the value of all aircraft contracts issued during the war. So there would not have been an aircraft industry producing all those B-24s and B-29s and all the other aircraft without the automobile industry. Once full-scale war production got underway in 1942, and then later, the auto industry faced very serious problems in getting enough workers to staff the factories, for the very simple reason that the armed forces began to drain off men between the ages of 18 and about 35 or so, and a lot of people also volunteered. In 1940, the U.S. Armed Forces had fewer than 500,000 men and women. It was a very small army. That army exploded to 4 million personnel in 1942 and 9 million in 1943. So it was an enormous ramp up in the size of our military. Enlistments and the draft drained away a very large part of the auto industry's traditional workforce, and the industry needed to draw on new sources of labor. Now, there were 3 main new sources of labor: African Americans, white men from Appalachia and some of the border states like Kentucky and Tennessee, and women. Now, I'm going to talk mainly about women workers today, but the white workers from the South and from Appalachia, I like to call the almost invisible group of workers that were important to the war effort. There's a story that during the war, a 4th grade teacher in Detroit asked her class, how many states are there in the United States? Remember, at that time, there would have been 48, because no Alaska and no Hawaii. Well, one kid raised his hand and said there's 46 states. And the teacher said, how can there be only 46 states? He said, because Tennessee and Kentucky are in Michigan. And to a large extent, a lot of them were here. And to a large extent, a lot of them were here. Here, we have a lot of statistics on the number of immigrants from those states and from West Virginia who came here to work in the plants. I'm going to talk mainly about women workers today. For those of you who would like to learn much more about all these workers and much more about the production miracle that made up the Arsenal of Democracy, you need to buy one or both of my recently published books. Could we have the first slide, please? The Arsenal of Democracy, the American Automobile Industry in World War II, and second slide, images from the Arsenal of Democracy for people who don't want to do a lot of reading but enjoy looking at photographs. Both of those are available after the talk tonight at a very deep friends and family discount rate, and I will sign them and not charge you anything more for that. In any case, enough for the commercial. I want to start off tonight by talking a little bit about women who worked in the auto industry before World War II. A lot of women were employed in the auto industry, which I include here, companies that made parts and components, as well as the original equipment manufacturers. And they worked in the industry in larger numbers than we commonly believe. There was a Bureau of Labor Statistics survey done in 1940, before the war started, and that survey identified almost 42,000 women who worked in the auto industry, which was 8% of the total workforce. So there were lots of women in the auto industry before the war. The war didn't present the very first job opportunities. Most women workers were employed in three types of production work. The sewing trades, which meant upholstery and working on interior trim work. Many assembled small parts from even smaller pieces, and they worked in assembling electrical wiring harnesses. There was a widespread belief among managers that women were better than men in assembling small parts and wiring harnesses because they had smaller hands, better dexterity with their littler hands. They had more patience working with small parts and putting things together. They didn't lose their cool so much. And there probably was a certain amount of truth to these beliefs. Could we have the next slide, please? I want to show you a sample of some images I found of women working in the auto industry well before World War II. This is about the earliest image I've ever seen of women assembling flywheel magnetos at the Ford Paquette Avenue plant in Detroit in 1908. And they were off in one separate room in the building. They had their own private bathroom, and they generally stayed away from those crude, rude, smelly, and stinky men that were in the rest of the plant. Next, please. Still assembling flywheel magneto parts at the Highland Park plant in 1915. Next. Working in the upholstery shop at the Ford Highland Park plant, again, in 1915. Next slide.
For that mag.
Yep.
That's what got them going.
Over there.
That horseshoe. Yeah.
At the peak, at the early stages of women work. At the early stages of women working at the Highland Park plant, there were about 50 women sewing machine operators who were making seat cushions, and another 50 that were making cloth body tops for Model Ts. Ford eventually had to create a private entrance for women only to go into that plant because they didn't want the women being harassed by the men with their lewd comments and whatever. So they had their own private entrance. They, of course, had their own private bathrooms. Still, by 1915, there were only about 250 women working at the Ford Highland Park plant, and this was at a time when Ford employed about 15,000. Next slide, please. Some more upholstery pictures from the Packard motor car plant, 1925. Next. Pinstriping. I found a couple of images of women pinstriping. The woman in the foreground looks like she's wearing high heels, which doesn't seem very practical. But next slide, please. And here's a woman applying pinstriping to Packards. Next. We come to wire harnesses. This is one of the few images I've ever seen of women actually assembling wire harnesses. This is at Dodge, Maine. Next slide. Okay, there's Rosie the Riveter. I said at the start of the war, about 8% of the workers in the auto industry were women. This had grown a lot from earlier years. In 1925, they made up only 2.5% of the workers. By the late 20s and 30s, we start seeing more women operating machines like punch presses, and their numbers continue to grow. Why did the auto industry hire so many women? Because they could pay them about half of what they were paying men. And they were basically as productive, and in some ways may have been more productive with fewer mistakes, better quality work, et cetera. Women workers faced a lot of discrimination from some employers, not all, through the 1930s. Some companies refused to hire married women, period. If you were married, they didn't want to hire you. They figured you were only going to work a while and then have a bunch of kids and then you were going to disappear. They sometimes would fire single women who got married. And by the way, for a very long time, schools would not hire married women to serve as teachers. And if you got married, you might keep that secret so you could keep your job. Sometimes they would fire women workers who became pregnant. They said, this is just too dangerous, they can't keep working here, and they're going to disappear anyways. With the beginnings of the war, particularly as the male, with the beginnings of the war, particularly as the male workers began to disappear, women working in the automobile/defense industry did increase rapidly. As late as July of '42, women accounted for only 6% of workers in all the UAW factories. But this share doubled by October of that same year up to 12% and reached 26% in November of 1943. 1943 was really the big changeover year when the auto plants producing defense products began to hire tens of thousands of women and African Americans, because basically their young white men were gone and they needed actually more workers than they needed before the war. Women worked at a variety of jobs in the defense industry, but a remarkable number built aircraft or aircraft components. In March of 1945, the auto industry employed about 800,000 people in their defense plants. And of that total, 334,000, or 44% of the total, worked on aircraft or aircraft components. Okay, so close to half of the auto industry's workers were working on aircraft stuff. Women made up 2/3 of all the auto industry workers who were working on aircraft. 2/3. So Willow Run was not unusual, and I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of women working in other aircraft plants from that era. So roughly 200,000 women were involved in working on aircraft in March of 1945. The real Rosie the Riveter of World War II was not Norman Rockwell's burly shipyard Rosie. Next slide. It was also not this wartime worker that has now become our sort of universal symbol for Rosie the Riveter. This Rosie was actually created by an artist using a press operator named Geraldine Huff as his model. This was J. Howard Miller, created this for the Westinghouse Corporation, and then it got adopted by the US government for use everywhere else, along with the "We Can Do It" slogan. The real Rosie was, of course, Rose Monroe from Kentucky, who worked here at this plant. And she was really the first person identified as Rosie the Riveter. And she did operate a rivet gun here at Willow Run. Now, before I look at the kinds of work that women did in the defense industry, I need to say a little bit about the severe discrimination faced by African American women who wanted to work in the defense industry. Before the war, the auto industry employed almost no black women, except for a few janitors. Even Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company that hired a lot of black men, sometimes as much as 15% of Ford's workers were African Americans, they did not hire any women, any black women. In April of 1943, the UAW did a survey of all of its Detroit area plants, and those plants employed 66,000 women. But only 4% of those women were African Americans. Very, very tiny share. Employers refused to hire black women because they claimed that their white female employees objected and did not want to work alongside black women. And when black women were hired in plants, it is true that white women often went on strike. The issue here was bathrooms, and there's no way to put this gently or in a gentlemanly fashion. Many white women believed that many black women carried venereal diseases and did not want to share bathrooms with them. And it was on that basis that they went on strike when black women were introduced. Companies like Ford, who had a good record of hiring black men, consistently refused to hire black women, even at Willow Run until very late in the war. In September of 1943, when Willow Run had 35,000 employees, and 35% of those were women, there were only 280 black women working in the whole Willow Run plant. And that was less than 1% of the total workers. And it didn't get much better at the end of the war. So we have to keep that in mind that, now this did begin to improve as we got further into the war, particularly towards the later part of 1944. A lot of companies solved this problem by creating segregated departments where you had all African American women working in a department, and they gave them their own separate bathrooms. So this issue disappeared in that sense. But many of the auto plants who had a lot of black workers, within the plants, they were very segregated. And I deal with this issue in much more detail in my books, so you can go and buy the books if you want to learn more. Well, what kind of work did women perform in the defense plants during the war? I'll go to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is the more typical Rosie the Riveter. These are women working on the center wing sections of the B-24 here at Willow Run. Next. Another group of women assembling B-26 fuselages at the DeSoto plant in Detroit. Next slide. Oh, this is one of the few examples I have found of an image with African American women workers. This is the 45 caliber ammunition packing line at the CHRYSLER Evansville plant. And if you look very carefully, every single woman working on that line is a different shade of black. Some have blonde hair, some are lighter skinned, some are darker skinned. They're all black women. And the only white folks you see is up towards the top, there are two white supervisors wearing ties. Everyone else in this assembly line is an African American female. Next slide, please. So what sort of work did women do? Well, they continued to work in the sewing and needle trades. And here you see hand sewing of fabric on a B-25 Mitchell. Next. Wiring harnesses became one of the most common jobs that women had in the war plants, other than running these lightweight riveting guns. Here you see women assembling wiring harnesses for Jeeps. Next. Preparing harnesses for Army trucks at Dodge, Maine. Next. Hudson workers installing wiring harnesses in the Martin B-26s. Next. One of my favorite pictures, this poor woman has the job of hanging and sorting out the wires that were needed for B-29 wiring harnesses. The B-29 had something like 7 or 8 miles worth of wiring just in that one. This is one of my favorite pictures anyways. Next. This is what they did when they were actually assembling these wiring harnesses. They had these special boards set up, and they were running these wires along the board in a certain pattern, and that's how they got these things together. Yeah, this wiring harness has 186 wires. Next. Another one of my favorite pictures, this Hudson worker is installing wiring harnesses in a B-29. Next. Small parts production. That's another carryover from the auto industry. And I'm just going to give you a sampling of probably 7 or 8 images here. These women are assembling bomb fuse rotor assemblies for NASH KELVINATOR. Next. Engine carburetor parts, Chevy plant in Bay City. Next. Gyroscope parts, Fisher Body Turnstead in Detroit. Next. GYROCOMPASS parts, Dodge, Maine. Yep. This is binocular assembly at a NASH KELVINATOR plant in Columbus, Ohio. Next slide. Then we come to aircraft assembly of parts and entire aircraft. Here are some Hudson workers building a bomb bay section in Detroit for the B-26. Next. Another terrific picture, riveting a bulkhead for B-29 tail section. Next. This is the 10,000th nacelle built in Fisher Body plant in Cleveland. And this is a mixture of women and male workers, but I think the women are about 3/4 of this group picture. Next. Wingtips for B-17 bombers, Murray Body. The automobile body companies, including Murray and Briggs and Fisher Body, converted over almost 100% to making aircraft components of one sort or another. And when you think about it, it's perfectly logical. They had been in the business of pressing out steel body parts for automobiles. They could simply convert those presses over, and it was not simple, to stamping out aluminum parts for aircraft. And that's what they all ended up doing. Next. Center wing sections for Curtiss-Wright in Detroit DeSoto plant. Next. One of my favorite pictures. A lot of riveting had to be done by 2 partners, one on each side of the rivet. And here you see 2 women working at the Hudson plant. Next. Another one of my favorite shots, B-29 bulkhead riveting at the Hudson plant in Detroit. Next. A lot of women worked as machine operators. We come back to that CHRYSLER Evansville, Indiana plant that made small cartridges for small caliber guns. And here you see almost entire workforce of women operating these machines. There in the foreground at the bottom, there's a very elderly man who's clearly too old to be in the Army. And behind him, somebody who may be too young. That could be a 16-year-old you're looking at there. The rest of this factory was manned largely by women. Next. It's also one of my favorites. Some of these companies gave their women company hats to wear, and I could do a whole study of hats and scarves and bandanas worn by women during the war. This is a Chevrolet engine plant in New York State. Next. This is also Chevrolet plant in New York State, and this woman is removing stock from carburetors. Next. Lathe operator, PACKARD Motor Car Company in Detroit. Next. I love this picture. This is a Packard milling machine operator who is absolutely gaga over the visit of this handsome Navy PT boat commander who came through the plant to see, by the way, the Packard Motor Car Company built all of the engines that went into all the PT boats. So that's why they would send these officers there for inspection trips. Next. These women are calibrating bomb sights at an AC spark plug plant, and I don't know if that's in Flint or somewhere else. Next. Women were also worked in a variety of other jobs. Here you see the Packard Motor Car Company workforce that are doing drafting. And there's a handful of men, but by this point in the war, most of the people doing drafting were women. They were now serving as draftswomen. Next. Oops, can you back that up? Yes. Plant protection officers. And these women were actually trained and eventually were considered to be part of the military. And they were armed. Next. This is a pistol packing Hudson security guard being trained in the use of a pistol. Next. Crane operator. It's not always the easiest picture to see, but you can see her silhouette in the upper right, lowering a tank using a crane. Next. This is another image that I love. It may be hard for you to see from where you are, but the women in this picture are wearing roller skates, and they're working in this White Motor Company parts plant in Chicago. And I love the look on the face of the woman on the far left. She looks like she's not a very happy camper. I don't like the fact they're taking her picture. Maybe she doesn't like her job, or she doesn't like the fact they're taking her picture. Next. Inspectors. One of the things I was really surprised to learn as I started doing this research was the disproportionately large number of women who worked in these plants as inspectors. Factories that produced aircraft engines typically had the largest staff of inspectors because they were inspecting every part of every engine twice during the course of production and testing. One of those plants, the Nash Motors factory in Kenosha, Wisconsin, had 1,000 inspectors, and more than half of them were women. One would think that older men in the plants with more seniority than women workers would want to claim these sort of cushy jobs, because they're not production jobs, they're, almost white-collar jobs. But management gave these jobs to women in enormous numbers. In a lot of the plants I looked at, almost the entire inspection force is made up of women. We don't really know why. None of the companies that operated these plants talked about this practice, and scholars who've looked at women workers in World War II have ignored this phenomenon as well. I can only speculate about why women became inspectors in such large numbers, but everything I'm going to suggest is merely speculation, and I'll leave it for you to think about this. I think it's possible that managers, first of all, believed that women were inherently more honest and trustworthy than men, so they would make better inspectors. They were more honest and trustworthy. They were more particular and careful and picky and thorough than most men in performing inspections. And you can speak to your experience with your spouses or children or other relatives. Men are more likely to say, it's good enough, let it go. And women were going to say, no, it's not good enough, this has to be redone. I think it may be just as important that women were more independent than most men working in the factories. They were not one of the boys. They were not drinking buddies with the men whose work they were inspecting. And so they could be trusted to say, this is wrong. This needs to be redone. Because it may mean the guy who did that sloppy work is going to get demoted or lose his job or get transferred somewhere else. Now, if you're a man and you go to the bar after work every day and have a few beers with these guys, you're probably not going to turn them in for shoddy work. But if you're an independent woman, you don't care. You don't even know these guys. So for whatever reason, women ended up with an enormous representation among inspectors. I'm going to show you a few pictures of some of the various kinds of inspection work we see women doing. Here, this woman is almost lost in those B-29 dorsal fins that are made for B-29s. These are 8 inspection stations for aircraft engine pistons at the Buick plant in Melrose Park, Illinois. Next. Inspecting pistons at the Hudson plant, December of '43. Again, another aircraft engine piston inspection job. Next. Cartridge casings, we come back to that Evansville, Indiana plant, and again, these are all women except that one man whose head is in the foreground, and they're doing all this inspection work. Next. One of my favorite images, Fisher Body plant in Grand Rapids, and this woman is inspecting 135 millimeter artillery shells. Next. Testing impellers to make sure they're properly balanced at the Rolls-Royce plant at PACKARD. Next. Rocket motor inspection, KELVINATOR plant in Detroit. Next. This woman is inspecting engine cylinder heads. We don't know where that is. It's one of the aircraft engine plants. Next. Gyroscope rotors, inspecting them for balance, GM Turnstedt in Detroit. Next. She's actually weight counting aircraft engine nuts to make sure they're of consistent weight and size. The photograph says, and I'm not making this up, this woman should not be mistaken for a grandmother weighing out ingredients for a cake. That's what it said. I'm not making that up. Next. Now, as the war ended, because of the agreements made between the companies, the government, and the military, men who had fought in the war, who came back home, got their jobs back. Basically, it was due to the seniority arrangements that all the car companies had with the UAW. If you had 2 or 3 years of seniority when you went off to war and you served for 3 years, you came back with 6 years of seniority. And if you were a woman who had just started working in the plant, say in 1942 or 43, you were out the door because seniority ruled. By April of 1946, and I think I pointed out earlier, once we get into 1943, women typically made up between 30 and 40% of the workers in the automobile defense industry. By April 1946, women were only 9% of auto workers, pretty much a return to the percentages from before the war. And women's share in the auto industry's workforce remained below 10% until 1980. And then in 1980, it jumped up to 14%, and then began to climb steadily from that point on. Today, women make up about 1/3 of the workers in the automobile industry. The wartime experience, I would argue, planted the seeds for these future advances that happened in women's job opportunities, but those seeds did not germinate and really flower until several decades after the end of the war, not really until the 1980s. So I'm going to end there. I'll be happy to ask or to answer any questions you have about anything I've talked about or anything I haven't talked about. Well, go ahead.
I have read that Ford Motor Company here at Willow Run paid men and women the same rate. Can you comment on that?
Yes. Something I skipped over a little bit in my talk, and I was afraid I was keep running on and on and on beyond my appointed time. At the beginning of the war, that was not the case. There were still very sharp differentials between what men were making and what women were making. But what I discovered is that the UAW became an advocate for women earning equal pay with men. Not because they loved women and thought this was the fair and just thing to do, but they wanted to stop the auto industry's practice, which started early in the war, with the auto industry would redefine a job as a woman's job and then pay less, a lot less, typically half of what they would pay men. Employers would often reclassify jobs that had been done by men earlier as women's work. The UAW wanted to stop that practice because it lowered pay rates for all their members, and they were afraid this pattern would continue after the war as well. There was a dispute over this practice between the UAW and General Motors, and the National Labor Relations Board ruled in July of 1943 that, quote, wage rates for women shall be the same as for men where they do work of comparable quantity and quality in comparable operations, okay? In other words, equal pay for equal work. And in later disputes, the UAW argued that if any job had ever been done by a man or could be done by men, then it should be called a man's job. And whoever was doing that job, even if it was a woman, should earn that same pay grade, same pay level. In August 1944, women's hourly wages in the auto industry were 84% of what men's hourly wages were. We're nowhere near that today. And the reason that that represented almost near equality was that when you take into account that men monopolized the skilled trades, jobs like machinist, electrician, plumber, carpenter, and those jobs were higher hourly wages. If you eliminated them from the equation, by that time men and women were basically making the same pay. And this was true of African Americans as well. There was a leveling of the pay levels, pay rates during the war because of that National Labor Relations Board ruling. That's a long answer to a short question.
Well, thank you.
Yes, sir, you had a question?
Oh, well, I mentioned about the Magneto was on them Model T Fords. I don't know if many people know what it was like. The Model T Ford ran, it was started with a battery, and it was switched over to Magneto. And that Magneto was on a flywheel. I don't know if many people know that.
Right, that was the sort of invention of a man named Spider Huff, who worked for Ford Motor Company. Yep. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir.
I don't know if I need this. You mentioned in the beginning the different groups that the African Americans, the women, and then the white men from Kentucky and Tennessee.
Right.
Were they over 35? Those white men group. I mean, weren't they susceptible to the draft if they were?
Yeah, they were. Some of them were older, and there were a lot of women who came up with families and with older husbands that were beyond the draft age. They were very severely discriminated against, and they were not particularly liked by the existing ethnic white populations that were already here. the Polish immigrants, Italian immigrants, German immigrants of earlier time periods. They sometimes would show up at the factory in their bare feet and had to be told, you need to wear shoes if you're going to work here. They really came from the poorest areas of West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee. And they faced a lot of discrimination along with African Americans. Yes?
Riots in 43 in Detroit?
Yeah, there was, the bigger theme I didn't talk about here because I haven't really got time to talk about African American workers, is that there were, the bigger theme I didn't talk about here because I haven't really got time to talk about African American workers, is that there were, first of all, a series of so-called hate strikes in many of the plants which were touched off when the first African American men were introduced into a department where they had not operated before. PACKARD had probably a dozen of these hate strikes where workers would go out on strike and would just say, we're not going to work if we have to work alongside these black men, so get rid of them or send them somewhere else. And that was part of the racial tension that helped lead to the Detroit race riot of June of 1943. There were other issues. There was serious shortages of housing and a lot of tensions over that, and other things as well. But yeah, that was part of the formula. Yes, sir. There were, I can't document many of them specifically, but there were race riot issues in most other war plants, particularly. There were, I can't document many of them specifically, but there were race riot issues in most other war plants, particularly when you get into borderline areas like St. Louis, Cincinnati, which are sort of southern cities in a lot of ways. There were a lot of very similar problems there as well. There's already a history at Ford and Dodge for hiring African American. No, Detroit had a much higher percentage of African American workers in the plants, partly because there was already a history at Ford and Dodge for hiring African Americans, and Detroit had a substantial African American population. Now, where there were auto plants in other cities like Chicago, where there was a lot of African American population, yeah, there were a lot of African American workers there, but you wouldn't find them so often in, say, southern shipyards. They were largely excluded from that kind of work. It's a very complicated story. If you buy my book that has more words than pictures, you can learn a lot more about that, those details. Not surprised. The problems in the war plants with African American men were not with the African American men. They were the white men that wouldn't accept them working.
They had no problems whatsoever.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. The problems in the war plants with African American men were not with the African American men. They were the white men that wouldn't accept them working there. And we're trying to sort of get rid of them as much as they could.
We all worked together at the time.
Yeah, what finally happened in Detroit, and it's interesting, once we get into late 1943, the so-called hate strikes ended. And by the way, there were some strikes at Willow Run involving race as well. But the hate strikes kind of ended because by that time, the union and the companies and the military finally just said, we're not going to put up with this nonsense anymore. This is hurting the war effort. If the Packard plant goes out for 4 days, we lose 4 days of Merlin engine production. And they finally just stepped on the ringleaders of these strikes, and among other things, at the Hudson, there was a Hudson arsenal plant up in Centerline. The Navy threatened to simply draft the entire workforce into the Navy overnight. And then you were under military discipline and military control, and if you disobeyed orders, you could be court-martialed or sent off to the front. And that happened at the Packard plant as well. Once the military and the PACKARD officials and the UAW finally came to an agreement, they basically fired some of the ringleaders. And once you were fired, then you didn't have any deferment, and you were very likely to get drafted right away. So late 1943, the hate strikes almost disappear here. And it's for that reason. They finally put their foot down. Yes, sir.
A lot of these women were probably finding out every day that their husband wouldn't be coming home. Did the union or the company have some sort of formalized way of helping them deal with that?
They really didn't, not to my knowledge. There may have been some of that on an individual basis, but generally the men held their seniority rights, and when they came back, the women got bumped. Now, there was a myth that was demonstrably false, that women didn't really want to keep their jobs in these auto plants anyways. Once the war ended and their husbands came back, or if they were single, they were going to get married and wanted to have a bunch of kids and didn't really like factory work. That's not true. The U.S. Labor Bureau did a survey of women workers in the war industries right after the war, and I think 70% said they would like to keep that same kind of work that they had been doing. Because when you think about it, if you don't have a factory job, particularly in a UAW plant with high wages, what were your options? You could be a waitress, right? You could be a school teacher, which didn't pay very good. You could clean house. There were not a whole lot of high-paid jobs available for women at that point, but the factory jobs did pay very good wages. And most women would have wanted to keep them, but they weren't allowed. They were sort of kicked to the curb.
Stayed home, I'd get paid, I'd give her the paycheck. Believe me, we had a wonderful time. We raised 3 children. There was the house.
Well, that's not much of an option. I wouldn't say yes to that either. By the way, just as an aside, one of the problems which I deal with in my
We were
book,
married for 60
I
years.
can believe that. One of the problems I dealt with in my book was that I'm a lot of sure. women with young children at home had daycare issues. They wanted to work. By the way, just as an aside, one of the problems which I deal with in my book, I can believe that. One of the problems I dealt with in my book was that a lot of women who had young children at home had daycare issues. They wanted to work in the plants, but they had trouble figuring out what to do with their kids. And in some cases, grandparents lived in the same neighborhood, and they would take over watching the kids, or trusted neighbors might. Some churches created daycare centers, but miracle of miracles, some of these war plants built daycare centers right at the plant, which is where most mothers preferred their kids to be. And they just recognized if we want these workers, we're going to have to accommodate the fact that they have 2 or 3 young children and take care of them. They can't just leave them at home alone. So, no, and that disappeared as well. There was a lot of progressive social policies that were adopted during the war that kind of disappeared after the war ended. Choice by the policies followed by industry
Get good
and
meals,
government.
come home, chicken pupper.
Okay, other questions? Oh, I know. But not all women wanted to do that, clearly, and they were not given a choice by the policies followed by industry and government. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir. But that law didn't really have very much teeth. A lot of
As part of the New Deal in the late 30s, we came up with the first equal opportunity employment rules. Were women included in this equal opportunity employment?
Yeah, they were, but that law didn't really have very much teeth. A lot of African American workers filed official complaints with that Equal Opportunity Commission, and because that commission had a staff of like 4 people to deal with the entire country, they were not very effective. The more effective actions that were taken by either the UAW or the local chapter of the NAACP that would sometimes picket factories that had these discriminatory practices. The federal government was pretty weak at that point in trying to, reverse all this. The policies were there on paper, but they didn't really, they really weren't very effective. By 2 or as many as you want.
Well, I want to.
Okay, other questions? Because if not, I will make myself available up at the front table to sell you copies of my book at a very deep discount. And you can buy 2 or as many as you want. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I want to thank Charlie for coming here. This is a fascinating story, much different than the one he told when he was here last October. And I did buy his book, and I'll give it an endorsement. It's a very fascinating read. You'll pick it up and not put it down right away.